Hello everyone! Within the last couple weeks, I reread Emma by Jane Austen. This was my fourth or fifth time reading the book, and the last time was back in 2012, so it had been a while and I was overdue. For those of you who don't know, I really like Emma. I first saw the 1996 Gwyneth Paltrow version when I was a kid, and I read the book shortly after, and I love both. That is my favorite adaptation, but I have also seen more than once the 96 Kate Beckinsale one, the 2009 one, and the 2020 one, and as of today, I've seen some of the 1972 one. Each version has its die-hard fans, and that's fine. I think they're all good. They're all worthy and enjoyable adaptations in different ways. I've reviewed a couple of these movies. I would like to review all of them sometime, and I've put links to my other Emma videos in the description. I had a lot of thoughts as I read, and I wrote some of them down, and then I didn't know what to do with them. I don't want to review the book, but I would like to share my observations with anyone who's inclined to hear them. I know a portion of my audience won't be interested in this at all, but there is a group of you who do like this kind of thing, so this is for you. Now, the comments I jotted down, I should put a spoiler warning in there. If you're not familiar with Emma at all, well, I don't know why you'd watch this video, but anyway, there are going to be spoilers discussed pretty freely. Now, the comments I jotted down were disjointed, but I've tried to organize them mostly by character. Some are long, some are short, and I started with, of all people, Mr. John Knightley, Emma's brother-in-law. I've been very fond of John Knightley in the past, but this time I saw him in a less favorable light. He's kind of a disagreeable person. He's moody, critical, and prone to irritation. And I have found that people like that can be difficult to talk to spend time with. They can be downright exhausting. But I am amused by his contrast with other characters, namely his doting wife Isabella, his good-natured, even-tempered brother, we'll talk about him later, his father-in-law, for whom Emma and Mr. George Knightley constantly have to play referee, and Mr. Elton. Watching Mr. Elton and Mr. John Knightley together is like watching a senior cat forced to sit with a hyper puppy. I often share John's sentiments, like his preference for staying home instead of going out, but he's so unfiltered. He says the type things you'd be better off keeping to yourself because they're bound to make someone else uncomfortable. It's nice that he gets to vent his negative feelings, but it just comes across as rude and self-indulgent. Unlike his brother, who makes a point of being courteous to everyone, he doesn't care much about being polite, so he'll be blunt or sarcastic, and I don't know, I've learned in the last few years that sarcasm can be funny in fiction, and it can be funny in real life, but more often than not, it isn't. Off-putting remarks like that, especially at someone else's expense, just tends to make people uneasy. And I don't find that good conversation. Austen had several characters with this edge. See Mr. Bennet, Mr. Palmer, and other husbands of silly women. I enjoy these characters in the movies, largely because of how humorous the actors are. But I realized a few years ago, when some commenters offered a more clear-eyed perspective on Mr. Bennet, just how caustic and hurtful these personalities can be, what damage they do to their marriages, and what poor examples they are for their children. Consequently, I'm much more critical of this type than I used to be. And there were times when I found myself saying, "Ugh, John is such a poop." He does get over himself, and that helps a lot, and I also forgot about his later visit and how kind and conversant he is with Jane Fairfax. That almost elevated him back to his former status in my eyes. Jane Fairfax. Volume 2, Chapter 2 is so good. First, at introducing Jane Fairfax objectively as a new, compelling character, then at showing Emma's irrational dislike and her efforts to improve the acquaintance until she hits a wall and gives up. Presented in such a way, I think Emma's feelings are understandable, even though right off the bat, I think the reader finds Jane more sympathetic than Emma does. Some commentators have tried to make more out of Jane Fairfax. I've seen arguments that she would make a more logical protagonist and a better heroine, and people point out how much she has in common with other gentle, long-suffering Austen heroines. There's fan fiction that attempts to expound on her history, and, well, that's fine. I just don't have that much interest in her beyond the page. I think it's interesting that Austen subverted the norm here, but I'm not that curious about her true personality and her background. And I think Emma makes a far more dynamic heroine, warts and all. That said, I did feel more compassion for Jane Fairfax this time than I recall ever feeling before. She spends so much of the story masking her misery. She has to evade all these questions and comments to hide the truth about her and Frank Churchill, a secret engagement that she never wanted to get involved with, and at the same time she's forced to watch him flirt with her neighborhood rival. It's awful. Frank Churchill. You only get one first impression of Frank Churchill, whether it's on the page or on the screen. The first time around, you are as unaware as Emma and her friends are, and therefore take his words and actions at face value. But after you've been through it once, can you see him as anything but a jerk for the way he talks about Jane Fairfax? Is this how a man in love speaks of his fiancée? Is this how he chooses to act to conceal their engagement? By insulting her appearance, her manners, and her family, and making false insinuations about her past? I don't think so. I know he pulls out the "I was just teasing" excuse, whatever, I hate that. And as far as his flirtation with Emma goes, he's all, "I'm sure she knew what was really going on the whole time," which is just bogus. Ugh. Such a stupid and dangerous assumption to make. I'm 100% with Mr. Knightley. That apology letter does not make me feel better. He's a selfish and manipulative liar, and honestly I think I dislike him more than Mr. and Mrs. Elton. And you know how horrible they are. And I'm sorry to say, I doubt he and Jane will have a happy marriage. I just don't see it. I know at the end he's contrite, and he's forgiven, and she's all smiles, but unless he grows up and quits acting like an idiot, I'm afraid he's gonna drive her crazy. I know he'd drive me crazy. Emma Woodhouse. People like to dump on Emma, and she has certainly got a lot of awkward lessons to learn before she becomes a more sensible, more sincere, more caring person. It is very easy to judge her, especially if you've been around the block once or twice yourself and you already understand how foolish it is to play matchmaker with a small group of friends. Just about everything she says and does in the whole Harriet Smith, Robert Martin, Mr. Elton fiasco is wrong, which causes me to groan my way through the first part of the book. But the extent of her flaws is what makes her growth so encouraging and so satisfying. It takes time, but she gets there, and because I feel there are elements of her character we can all relate to, I think her huge improvement shows that there's hope for us all. Also, let's not overlook her good qualities, like her self-control when it comes to Mrs. Elton, and the way she looks after her father. Emma exhibits admirable patience and forbearance in her dealings with a lot of exasperating people. And though she's a young woman, she's mature and self-possessed. She's the experienced and capable mistress of a large estate, and she's a good hostess who cares about keeping her guests happy. And for all her pride and vanity, when she does finally examine herself and seek to know herself, there is no one more critical of her own character than she is. As for her relationship with Jane Fairfax, in my opinion, Emma isn't nearly as peevish and phony toward Jane in the book as she is in some adaptations. She does try to be nice and polite in their interactions. She's well-bred, remember, and Mr. Knightley wouldn't love her if she was rude, snide, or witchy. So I think it's unfortunate that some adaptations exaggerate this aspect to make Emma into a mean girl. That said, she does say a lot of cringy things, and I don't care for her and Frank's little comments, especially the ones criticizing reserved people, which I took personally. They both come across as gossipy and arrogant and lacking in empathy, but I do think that were it not for Frank's influence, Emma wouldn't have said half of these things. Mrs. Elton. I don't really have much to say about her, except that while I despise both her and her husband, there is something fun about her. Mr. Elton is a loathsome social climbing hypocrite, but she falls more into the love-to-hate category. She's just so shameless. I think one of the funniest paragraphs in the book is during the strawberry picking outing, when Austen herself seems to get tired of Mrs. Elton's egocentric monologuing, so she just condenses her long speeches into phrases. Box Hill. Ugh. Words cannot describe the dread I feel whenever the Box Hill part approaches. I almost can't stand the secondhand shame and mortification. I know Emma's the one who says the thing, and it's badly done indeed, but Frank Churchill instigated it, and this was the part in my reading when I said, you know what? He's worse than the Eltons, and he's worse than Wickham and Willoughby and all the other bad boys in Austen's lineup. He is just such a petty, deceitful, unreliable, selfish child of a man, and I can't stand him. The Box Hill scene is not quite so bad on paper, since you can't see everyone's awkward expressions and reactions, and as much as I dread it, it is a pivotal event. It has to happen. Emma doesn't fully realize what she's done wrong in the moment, but once Mr. Knightley upbraids her, she acknowledges her guilt almost immediately, accepts it without trying to blame someone else, and she determines to set things right the very next day. The only thing is that I feel Austen kind of dropped the ball on this one. Emma never says to Miss Bates anything like, "I'm sorry I hurt you, I regret what I said, please forgive me," and I missed that. It would have been truly humbling, therefore I think it would have been good for her. At least they have a nice long, pleasant conversation, and the act of visiting alone is meant to be an apology, and Emma asks questions and is very sincere in the visit, and so that's supposed to be enough, and I prefer that an adaptation show some of that reconciliation. Harriet Smith. I don't have much to say about Harriet, except the other disappointing thing about the resolution is that she and Emma don't really resume their friendship on a better footing. Instead, it just ends with the concession that they never ought to have been so close to begin with because of the difference in their social status. Now, with Harriet becoming Mrs. Martin, and Emma becoming Mrs. Knightley, and a friend of Jane Fairfax, as she always should have been, they have taken their proper places. Okay, but there's still some classism on display there, and I just disagree that a rich girl and a poor girl of unknown parentage shouldn't be friends, even in the historical context. And as it turns out, Harriet's father is in trade, so not as bad as it could have been. This is one area where I disagree with Mr. Knightley. He says the friendship will do harm to both parties, and he is right, of course, But I don't like that the root of the argument is his social prejudice against Harriet. It's not just that she's less educated and kind of a ninny, and therefore not Emma's intellectual equal. But that's also one of the endearing things about Mr. Knightley. He gets to know Harriet, recognizes she has many good qualities, and admits he was wrong. I love that humility and honesty. Romance. Jane Austen's prose is not really romantic. I think some people who refuse to come near her stuff because it might give them cooties are under the misapprehension that her books are mushy love stories or rom-coms catering exclusively to girls who drool over bonnets and cravats. But if you actually read any of her books, you won't find frilly, hyper-feminine language. The writing is direct, clever, and perceptive. Her sentences are complex and logical, never fluffy. She examines all kinds of relationships, not just romantic ones, and while some of her characters are ridiculous, Austen herself, as narrator and psychologist, never is. So Emma the novel is not ostensibly romantic, rather it's a character study, which is why most of my notes are about characters. That said, it does eventually reach a point where it gets pretty romantic, especially if you're able to read between the lines, and Mr. Knightley is, and has for a long time been, my favorite Austen hero. Mr. Knightley. I think the first time you notice that he's a stand-up guy, though there are several hints before that, is at the Westons' Christmas party. While everyone else is freaking out about the snow and just woo, he is quickly, subtly, and decisively coming up with a plan for Emma's father and privately communicating that to her so they can get him home. There is a sharp contrast in this scene between him and Mr. Weston, who is a character I find I like much less in the book than in the films. Since it had been over a decade since I last read the book, it was nice to encounter scenes and interactions I had forgotten about. Like when everyone's visiting the Bates home, and Mr. Knightley rides by, and Miss Bates is basically yelling at him through the window, and everybody in the other room can overhear their entire conversation, and he's like, "Oh, is Emma there? Well, I guess I might step in for a few minutes. Oh, Frank's there too? Never mind, gotta go." The chapter about the ball is a nice one for Mr. Knightley fans. I like when Emma is privately admiring his appearance, and she's thinking, he's the best looking guy in this room next to Frank Churchill. And then she observes him, observing her. Ooh! But one of the most shocking and outrageous omissions, for adaptation fans in particular, is that Jane Austen doesn't describe their dance. The chapter just ends with brother and sister, indeed we are not. It's so lame! Considering that each new adaptation makes a bigger deal out of the dance than the last one did, it's crazy that Austen didn't say anything about it. She doesn't describe it, she doesn't include any of their conversation. All she says at the beginning of the next chapter is that her interactions with Mr. Knightley were the highlights of Emma's evening. So here you are expecting this dramatic moment that shows the hero and the heroine being attracted to each other, and it's not there. You have to wait a good long while for the first truly romantic interaction, which I would say occurs when Emma returns from visiting Miss Bates, and it's a lovely moment where you feel the dynamic shifting between them. And, well, it's a paragraph that can make your heart go pitter-patter. And then a couple chapters later, you get that wonderful proposal scene, where they're kind of stepping all over each other and failing to communicate in a way that's never been an issue for them before, until finally he unexpectedly unveils his feelings. And if you didn't already know from all the subtle hints, his words reveal how deeply he feels things and how much in love with her he has been this whole time. If you don't like Emma, or you think she's a bad person, I don't know how you can be happy with this outcome. Mr. Knightley is the best Austen hero. He's friendly, modest, communicative, wise, he's thoughtful, He's generous, he does things for others without being flashy, he anticipates a need and takes care of it without waiting to be asked, and he does it privately without seeking praise. He is a gentleman through and through, and he is also surprisingly graceful, which is a physical quality that Emma notices that's kind of rare. He is the perfect guy. So, if you love him, but you can't stand her, it must drive you crazy that she ends up with him. But I love this relationship. It's rooted in friendship, they respect each other's opinions, and they talk to each other. Sure, they often disagree in the conversations that we're privy to, and Emma has spent most of her life trying to provoke him, but their mutual respect and admiration can't be underrated, especially when Austen shows so many other marriages where respect is sadly lacking. They are physically attracted to each other, but they're also on an equal footing emotionally and intellectually. They like each other. They like spending time together. They like discussing things. They share little jokes. And they're good for each other. It did occur to me that some of the things I like about their relationship are also things I like about Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester's relationship. At least I'm consistent! And those are all the notes I had, plus a few extra things I thought of while I was putting this together. I tried not to talk about the adaptations too much, although the temptation was there, but I wanted to keep this video focused on the book. I have reviewed 2 of the adaptations in full. I also did a short review of the 2009 one some years ago. I fully intend to review more Emma adaptations in the future. I don't know when, but it's on my to-do list. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of this if you'd like to share them in the comments below, and I'll be back soon with another video. Thanks for watching.